So welcome back, everybody, to our little class on Calvin's political theology of exile. We're very lucky, obviously, to have Professor Rosario here with us. But I think we're going to start with just a little recap of what was talked about last week. And then we will continue on our discussion, our exploration. So with that, I'm going to cede the floor.
All right. Thank you. Well, as you know, we've been looking at Calvin as really a model for a contemporary political theology, but what I'm hoping is that we'll see certain common themes of the Reformation that manifest themselves in a politically engaged theology, what some people might call a public theology. So let me share the screen here. We set the context.
Yes. Sorry, let me.
We set the context of Calvin and his
You should be able to
struggles
share
in
now.
Geneva. Then we looked at what he had to say specifically as far as the relationship between church and state. And Calvin is someone who had some very firm opinions in that area. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay. There we go.
Oh, there's two little me's on here now.
There we go. No, I want to leave that there in case someone decides to talk, then we can.
Oh yeah, I should remind people, feel free to put your questions in the chat or unmute and just
we're a small
project.
enough group that we can work that way. But basically, we ended last week by raising a few questions about the fact that even though Calvin was trained in law and had written the Constitution for the city-state of Geneva, not just the church order, the confession of faith as a theologian, but had been asked by the city elders to also write the civil government's constitution, that the irony was that throughout his life in Geneva, he was a resident alien. He arrived to Geneva as a political refugee, was a resident alien for most of his life there, and it only was a few years before his death that, after a major altercation with an anti-immigrant party in the city of Geneva that was quite could have disrupted and destroyed the entire Reformation effort in Geneva. Only then did they grant him citizenship. So even though we often have this image of Calvin as someone who ran and governed Geneva like a theocrat, Calvin had no voice, no vote. He simply impacted politics in Geneva from the pulpit. And I mentioned last week that you could, to this day, read the minutes of the city government, and throughout it, he's referred to as illegalis in Latin, that Frenchman. And so we're going to talk about that today, about the fact that part of the experience that fed into this notion of a theology of exile was his own experience as a political refugee, as someone who in 1536, once there was a death penalty imposed on him, had to flee his homeland of France, never to return. And so that's where we begin, the undocumented Calvin. But I want to bring it to the contemporary context, and I want to revisit the recent refugee crisis back in 2016, 2017, and into 2018. We were dealing with a lot of issues of immigration. First, it was the Syrian crisis, and during the campaign in 2016, Trump promised that if he wins, Syrian refugees would be sent back. And unfortunately, certain evangelical figures supported him in this, most notably Franklin Graham. And I think what was most disingenuous was that after Trump's election and after Trump began to impose travel ban on 7 majority Muslim nations, In an interview with the Huffington Post, Franklin Graham said, "It's not a biblical command for the country to let everyone in who wants to come. That's not a Bible issue." Not a Bible issue, question mark, right? What's interesting is anyone who lived through the 1980s, the rise of the moral majority, followed by the Christian coalition, and has followed American politics ever since, knows that at least for the last 20, 30 years, the evangelicals in this country have been very politically active. And in fact, everything for them is a Bible issue. They will come at public policy by appealing to Scripture. And so it felt a little disingenuous, but more importantly, this notion of being a political refugee, what would Jesus do, right? And even though this became a kind of a glib remark, and if you remember back in the 90s, kids used to wear those bracelets with WWJD on it. The truth is, when he questioned biblical teaching on immigration and refugees, he's ignoring the admonition of Matthew 25 to care for the least of these, or the Torah teaching concerning aliens living among us, immigrants living among us in Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And of course, the little political cartoon here, the Christmas story. Now, the truth is that when they went to Bethlehem for the census, they weren't refugees. However, once the angel told Joseph to flee because King Herod wanted to kill the Christ child, they fled to Egypt. They were political refugees and stayed in Egypt until the death of King Herod. So the Bible has a lot to say about immigration, about political refugees, and about our role as Christians regarding these issues. And during the Trump presidency, I think it fixated on the border wall, right? That march in 2018, where they called out the military. And the idea was, we're going to stop people from entering the country. And the problem with that is that if you read the 14th Amendment, right, it says that anyone is welcomed into this country seeking asylum as a refugee. They cannot be kept from entering the country. That doesn't mean they get to stay. Once they're in the country, they would then go through a hearing, and a judge would decide whether or not they had a legitimate case for refugee status. What Trump was trying to do, though, was circumvent the Constitution and prevent people seeking refugee status from even entering the country. And they got the help of the Mexican government, and they basically set up camps on the south end of the border where people would wait for months, now even years at a time, to have their case reviewed. In the meantime, they're living in abhorrent conditions. It's become a haven for crime. The strong preying on the weak. Children and women in particular are victimized. And it's been a nightmare. And of course, it got compounded when they then put those who were entered into the country as refugees in these detainment camps along our southern border, and then started separating children from their parents. So again, all of these issues should concern us. If we take the words of Christ seriously, the Sermon on the Mount, the notion of loving your neighbor as yourself, we should be very concerned about this humanitarian crisis. But it's a hot button issue. It's been part of our body politic for so long. It's really divisive. And there are a lot of myths about immigration. That immigrants are a drain on the economy. That immigrants take jobs from Americans. That immigrants can enter legally if they follow the rules. If you follow the rules, you need to have access to a good immigration lawyer. You need to have someone hosting you in this country. All these things need to be in place, and on average, it takes about 10 years before you get a green card. Not citizenship, just a green card. So the myth is that it's easy to enter the country legally. They've created obstacles and hurdles to doing that. And I think that the most disturbing myth that the most recent administration propagated was this notion that we're being overrun by immigrants. And the truth is that since 2015, immigration into this country has dropped radically. Uh, uh, there is no threat of being overrun. In fact, many of our industries, even before COVID, were suffering because the drop in uh, migrant workers was causing them to lose crops that weren't being harvested on time. The construction industry was suffering. The hotel and restaurant industry was suffering. So again, it's this myth that immigrants are taking jobs or affecting the economy. In fact, studies have shown that we need more immigrants to keep the economy running. So politics and irrational fears sometimes govern, not facts. Um, but what does all this have to do with John Calvin? As I said, John Calvin was someone who spent his entire adult life as a political refugee, as an immigrant, and as a resident alien. And so it's only natural that his theology would address these issues and eventually have something to say about them. And so the image that I chose to encapsulate his political theology is that of exile. For John Calvin, this life is an exile. It's a journey, it's a pilgrimage. But we shouldn't get too attached to this world because this is simply a place of exile. We're all exiled. What it means to be a Christian is to recognize that, to paraphrase the old blues song, I ain't got no home in this world. We are all on a journey elsewhere. But if you look at his own life, he left Paris in 1533. He was under a cloud of controversy after he wrote this famous sermon. He himself didn't preach it, but he wrote it or helped write it. It was preached by Nicholas Kopp, and someone in the king's household nailed a copy of the sermon onto the king's bedpost. And so Calvin became public enemy number one. He eventually fled in 1536 and was on his way to Basel when he was kind of shanghaied by William Farel to lead the Reformation there in Geneva. Then in 1538, he had a difference of opinion with the city elders. They wanted to have a more lax practice of communion. They wanted, they did not insist on everyone agreeing to a singular confession of faith. And for Calvin, doctrine was important. Long story short, Calvin and two other pastors were exiled from Geneva, and he did not return until 3 years later. But when he returned, spent the rest of his life in Geneva and returned on such terms that they invited him not only to be the head pastor, not only to write the new confession and the book of worship, the 1541 ecclesiastical ordinances, but also to write the city constitution. But he spent that life there in Geneva as a resident alien, and it wasn't until 1559, 5 years before his death, that he became a citizen. As I mentioned, Calvin was a strong personality. People didn't like him. And part of that is because he would push the city government. He would push the city council. I gave the example last week of Calvin wanted public education funded by the state from grades K through 12. The city government didn't want to spend that much money, so they agreed to fund public education up through the 8th grade. But Calvin had a strong opinion. Calvin had a vision for what would make the Reformation successful, and part of that included a literate and educated population. In a sense, everyone is called to be a theologian and to read Scripture and to reflect on the beliefs of the church. But the other piece was that as Europe continued this struggle of the Protestants trying to find a place within Europe, which was at that point predominantly Catholic, the wars of religion began. And in particular, the French Huguenots were being persecuted by King Francis, And so between the years of about 1545 and 1560, which was also the most active decade of Calvin as head pastor there and in Geneva and a theology professor at the Genevan Academy. The population of Geneva increased by more than 60%. And this influx of immigrants led to the creation of an anti-immigrant party. Now, today, when we think about immigrants, we think about the poor, those who walk to the border, carrying their children, barely able to survive. And that was a big part of what was happening. The wars of religion displaced a lot of populations. But one of the unique things about the immigrant situation in Geneva is that when the city-state became Protestant, they forced the ruling noble family, who were Catholic, out of the city. And so it became a democratic representative government. But one of the characteristics of the waves of French immigrants in particular is that it was the ruling classes in France, a great number of the nobility, many of whom had become Protestant, and so King Francis exiled them, who fled to Geneva and brought their wealth with them and were used to having influence and status. And so one of the things that bothered native Genevans is, well, we got rid of one nobility and now we have to deal with a foreign nobility, and they have money, so they have power, and it created tensions. So that's the main reason that this anti-immigrant party became so powerful. This is an image of a 17th century riot that took place. Calvin was in the 16th century, but even 100 years after Calvin, they were still having some issues. But we need to understand and have a bit of sympathy for the native Genevans. Again, they had gotten rid of the Catholic Savoyard nobility, and now they found themselves surrounded by exiled nobility, and not just from France, but from Italy, from Poland, from Great Britain. And ultimately, when the Academy of Geneva was founded, and it existed primarily to educate clergy and to educate lawyers, but eventually doctors, etc., all but one of the professors were foreign. Only one of the professors at the academy was Genevan by birth. And all of the pastors in Geneva were foreign, most of them French. So you can understand the tensions, you can understand the resentment, the anti-immigrant sentiment. And when historians look at the roles of citizens and residents of Geneva for that time period, most of the immigrants were educated, had crafts, or were guildsmen or merchants. So lists of physicians, lawyers, printers, textile manufacturers, people claiming noble titles, it had overwhelmed the local Genevan population, and many feared that it would undermine the democratic process of building a Genevan city-state. But ultimately, it was a businessman in Geneva who called himself a patriot. The language sounds familiar to us.
Yeah, I mean, this whole time you've been talking, I've just been thinking about how like none of these narratives are strange to us. I mean,
exactly, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so he called himself a patriot. They called themselves the libertines. The idea being that this new foreign influence was restricting and imposing, right, these strict laws. Calvin always was considered a bit of a Pharisee because he emphasized discipline, and especially moral discipline. But the truth is, Calvin was a theologian of grace. They were wrong in calling him that. But in order to differentiate themselves, they went to the other extreme. If anyone knows the meaning of the word libertine, it's someone who is of loose morals and takes liberties, right, and does what they want. But again, this was all propaganda. This was all an attempt to regain control, in their opinion, because Calvin and his foreign supporters were now controlling the government. That was the impression. Keep in mind that at the time, there was not a single foreign-born person in the city council. And the city council, the city government, consisted of the large house, which was kind of like the House of Representatives, and then the small house, which was kind of like the Senate. And it wasn't until long after Calvin's death that they had the first foreign-born member of the city government. So again, it was all perception. It wasn't reality. But nonetheless, things were unstable. Keep in mind, Geneva had survived the Black Plague recently. During Calvin's time, they had a struggle with the Black Plague, and part of the reason that it spread was because the city was overcrowded, didn't have adequate sewage, and of course they blamed the foreigners. Calvin very intelligently said, no, we don't have adequate sewage, and so he pushed the city government to build new sewers and to create better health conditions, public health conditions. But in 1555, everything came to a head. And eventually Perrin was able to gather his libertines together, and they started chanting, "Kill the French," in the crowded streets. They started vandalizing the shops owned by foreign tradesmen and merchants. And they started marching. Tell me if this sounds familiar. They started marching on the legislature. They were heading to the council chambers to occupy the council chambers. And as they arrived there, in this angry crowd chanting "Kill the French," Calvin stood in front of the angry anti-immigrant party and proclaimed, "If you must shed blood, let mine be first." And, thank heaven, cooler heads prevailed. I think they were shocked that he called them on it. And I think the crowd didn't turn. I don't think Perrin had that as much support as he was hoping for. I think in many ways his protest was an act of desperation because Calvin had proved to be good for the city. And in all, most people were benefiting from the reforms that had been implemented. Regardless, though, it did come to violence, and thank heaven that when it came to a confrontation, cooler heads prevailed, and Perrin was arrested. The riot was prevented, and eventually Perrin was exiled from the city for causing, for an insurrection. He was held accountable for his actions. Go figure. But in the aftermath of this anti-immigration protest and Perrin's defeat, things began to change. Until then, the city had not encouraged immigrants to become citizens. In fact, many Genevans were hoping that the immigrants would move on. But they stayed because Geneva was a successful experiment in democracy and in religious freedom. And so by 1960s, the laws were changed and many immigrants were allowed to become citizens. Calvin himself became a Genevan citizen in 1559. And that was the first time where the son of an immigrant was allowed to sit in the Council of 200, which is like the House of Representatives. But it wasn't until 35 years later, long after Calvin's death, 30 years after Calvin's death, that the first son of an immigrant sat in the small council. In other words, where the real power was. So what does all this have to do with theology?
I just want to pause here for a second
please.
and give space for anybody who has questions. There's been a lot of history thrown at everybody, and there's a lot of correlates.
And speak up And I believe that when you start speaking, this thing, whatever it's called, Zoom, brings you to the front. So we'll be
Yeah.
able to see you.
Yeah. So you should just be able to start talking and you'll come up. But there's obviously a lot of narrative correlation between what occurred in Calvin's time in Geneva and situations that we deal with on a daily basis and that have been a part of our history as well. So if you want to ask about that too, I just want to make sure that we have space for questions before we continue on.
I do have one.
Go ahead, John.
So when I think about immigration, especially in America in the last century or so, I think about, two loaded terms now, assimilation and segregation.
Yeah.
And my question, I guess, is how would, and maybe we're about to get to it, but how would Calvin and the Genevans of the 16th century have thought about segregation and assimilation?
Well, it's interesting that one of the things we talked about last week, right, was that each immigrant community had its own little fund, purse, if you will, to help. So it began with the French fund to help French immigrants, but then the Italians copied it, the Poles copied it. But Calvin was very cosmopolitan. If you read Calvin's vision of the Protestant Reformation was to create an ecumenical church where local reform movements defined their specific how they wanted to worship, the contents of their confession of faith, in dialogue with other communities. But in the end, it would be one church, right? But with enough local variance and freedom that as long as we had a certain core confession of faith, we were free to live out our faith in our own unique cultural, linguistic, etc. And so what Calvin eventually did is that he took all those little works of ministry and social welfare that were taking place based on nationality, and he made it part of the deacon's ministry. He made it a permanent part of the church's ministry, but without any ethnicity attached. Anyone who needed help and came. So he basically was trying to integrate everyone into the church, into the community. I mentioned this last week as well, was that the first Protestant missions in the New World, the Catholics got here first. The Franciscans and the Dominicans have been very successful in the American South and Southwest. But the first Protestant missionaries in the New World were not in the English-speaking 13 colonies. It was in Brazil, and it was a mission founded by Calvin's church in Geneva, and they sent 3 French Huguenot pastors who had been educated at the academy in Geneva, and their goal was to evangelize the indigenous population of Brazil. Unfortunately, in order to get the approval, they had to appeal to the French crown. Well, as you know, Francis didn't like the Protestants, but one of Francis's main admirals, Admiral Coligny, was a Protestant. And so they were building a fort in Brazil, and to appease Coligny, Francis allowed it, and they were allowed to establish a Huguenot mission there in 1555. The same time that Calvin was dealing with the anti-immigrant problems, they were establishing a Protestant mission in Brazil. The pastor learned the language of the indigenous population, wrote a dictionary, which is still around, and was having great success. 2 things happened. The commanding officer of the camp betrayed them and imposed a Catholic rule. Everyone had to follow the Catholic doctrine, and so made it illegal for Protestants to worship, and they still did it. Eventually arrested them. And then the Jesuits got jealous because the Protestants were having such an effective outreach with the indigenous populations there in Brazil. And so the first recorded case of an auto da fe, of someone being tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in the New World was a French Huguenot Calvinist pastor who had been evangelizing the indigenous. He was imprisoned until 1558 and eventually burned at the stake. All of this part of Calvin's missionary effort in the New World. It failed, sadly, but it was meant to be a model for what Calvin wanted to do, which is a cosmopolitan church where pastors are educated in Geneva, but then go out throughout the world and establish churches. That was the model. And it was very cosmopolitan. These pastors learned the language. And if you know anything about the Spanish missionaries, they didn't always attempt to get to know the culture. They would impose their faith, often at force. And so it's one of those what might have been, had they been allowed to continue preaching in the New World. But by 1560, they were all killed or returned to Europe, unfortunately. Does that help get to your concerns, your questions?
Yes, I think it does kind of provide like a little more background, modern ideas with.
Yeah. And if you recall last week, I shared this quote from a Scottish missionary there in Geneva who couldn't believe what Calvin had managed to do. He had Italians, Poles, Spanish, French, English, Scottish, and Genevans all living together without killing one another. He said, if you want any proof that this is a work of the Holy Spirit, there it is, right? So there's something to be said for what Calvin was trying to do. And I will say this, it was not an original idea of Calvin's. Calvin studied with Martin Bucer and spent 3 years after he was exiled from Geneva working with the poor in Strasbourg with Bucer before Bucer was invited to Oxford and England to help shape the Anglican Reformation. And so it was Bucer's vision of a kind of cosmopolitan, universal, European ecumenical church that would look different in different countries, but would be one reforming church. And what's interesting is Bucer felt that the way to do that was by preserving the Latin language. Even though we equate Latin and the Latin Bible with Catholicism, Latin was a dead language. And so it didn't have those ethnic ties that other languages had. And so the idea was that Calvin wrote in Latin. That's the picture up on the screen, his Institutes of the Christian Religion. So it was this vision of a cosmopolitan, non-nationalist, non-ethnic-centered, inclusive vision of church. Very different from the state churches of Catholicism, where you were the Church of Poland, the Church of Germany, yes, all under Rome. But at the time, in the 16th century, what was happening was there was this tension between Rome and then the various national churches. It didn't help that at one point there were 3 different popes, right? And no one knew who was in charge. But part of the Reformation was to move away from linking our national identity to our faith, which is very relevant for what's happening in our country today, I think.
It was also like a radical shift in how people conceived of the practice of Christianity in their day.
That's right. I mean, look at the Reformation in England. It was a national church, right? Now, Elizabeth was in conversations with the Genevan Academy, invited Genevan pastors to come preach, but in the end, she wanted the church tied to the crown, right? And so it became a national church. And to this day, the Queen is the monarch in England is the head of the church. Kind of laughable, but anyway, that's a whole other story.
So I have kind of a different question. You're talking a little bit about Geneva at Calvin's time in U.S. today. I'm kind of curious about Geneva. today. You know,
Mhm.
we all know Geneva is part of Switzerland. It's they choose to really not participate on one side or the other. They never choose. They don't go to war. They just and they have created for themselves a really nice little niche where they're not expected to do that. It's a place of great wealth, incredible wealth, and because there's so many uh, banks and other world institutions there, I'd be kind of interested in your perspective on Geneva today compared to Calvin, and what
Like most
they
of
teach.
Europe. Oh, sorry.
I mean, I'd be interested in
Yeah.
what the children in Switzerland learn about that period or about Calvin, whether or not it's important or it's not. I'm just
Yeah.
kind of curious. 500 years later, whatever.
Like most of Europe, it's very secularized. Um, the Calvin, as he's remembered in history, is this kind of sour, puritanical figure. So much so that there's a famous statue in Geneva of the four major reformers there in Geneva, and it had Calvin, Theodore of Beza, William Farel, and I always forget the other one. But Calvin's head has had to be repaired and replaced several times because it's been vandalized so often. So that gives you a sense, right? It's very secularized. To put it in an interesting perspective, about 100 years after Calvin, in the 17th century, when the political philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau was writing and living in Geneva, um, he had great things to say about Calvin because of the reforms that he'd instituted and the constitution that he'd written, and the fact that it was a model for our Constitution here in the U.S. I believe 8 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Reformed theologians or pastors, and the idea is that it's always shared governance. There's never any unilateral decision making. There are checks and balances, right? And so for Rousseau, that was the uh, the biggest impact that Calvin's Geneva had on modern Geneva, this democratic model. I
Mhm.
did a study and wrote an article on the reception of John Calvin in Latin America. Not a very Calvinist place. There are pockets in Argentina, in Guatemala, in Mexico, um, but on the whole, oh, Brazil as well. But on the whole, Calvin was not read. He was on the list of banned books in Latin America until 1850. Um, But what I started reading was when Latin American countries began to separate themselves from Spain and began to declare independence, that's when you start seeing references to John Calvin in the literature. The political theorists were using the last chapter of the last book of Calvin's Institutes on civil governance the same way that the founding fathers of the US had used it as a model for a representative democracy with checks and balances. So I would say Geneva today, very secular. I think a lot of the things that you pointed to were things of the modern. Um, uh, it's no longer just a city state, it's part of Switzerland, right? Um, but if you think about it, during the 20th century, it became a place for exiles fleeing communism, right? They were welcome there, they were safe
Yeah.
there. During Nazi Germany, sadly, Switzerland, even though they were technically neutral, um, as you mentioned, their banking industry has a lot to atone for because they helped finance the Nazis and they helped launder stolen wealth from Jews. Um, so definitely not a perfect place.
Yeah.
But I do think that where Calvin himself remains an influence has been in ecumenical dialogue. The Catholic Church has found Calvin's theology more amenable than Luther's theology for ecumenical dialogue. Even though recently the Lutherans and the Catholics especially around the communion, have had more in common. Um, during Vatican II, there was a renewed interest in Calvin, so much so that Calvin was actually invited to attend the Council of Trent and would have been a Protestant observer there. And there were still efforts to reunite the Protestants with the Catholics as late as 1545. Unfortunately, Calvin heard of a plot to assassinate him en route to the council, and so he decided wisely not to go. Again, one of those what could have been, what might have been. But you know, there is something in Calvin that still tries to think broadly, not denominationally, but ecumenically. We are
Right.
one church despite our divisions.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Very helpful.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated about the power and coercive personality that Calvin had, despite
Yeah.
the fact that your description of him and how people felt about him being negative. So
Yeah.
I'm just trying to figure out what in the world it was about him then that.
Well, so much of Calvin's reputation was actually made and spread by his biographer, Theodore of Beza, his successor as the head pastor there in Geneva. A lot of myth making. Calvin himself was actually quite humble. We know very little about him from his own writings. If you read all his sermons, his institutes, his commentaries, there are only a few very brief passages that are autobiographical. So
Which says something about the center of his theology too.
yeah. Well, when he passed away, he asked that he be buried in an unmarked grave. He didn't want to be made this saint of the Reformation. He didn't want to be made this figurehead, and so there is no grave to visit or idolize. But Beza, in establishing himself as the head pastor, created a lot of this myth of Calvin as a way to strengthen his own position there as head pastor in Calvin's succession. So again, we have to be very careful. But I learned from one of my professors at Princeton, Elsie McKee, and if you haven't had a chance to study with her yet, I hope you do, that we really need to look to his letters, his personal correspondence, to get to know Calvin. And so one of the things she did was she wrote an anthology for the Classics of Western Spirituality series on Calvin. And she translated a lot of his pastoral letters because it gives us a very different image of this dour, authoritarian Calvin. But the truth is that the culture was so different from our own today. Before anyone received communion, they had to go before the elders of the church and demonstrate that they were in a right state, penitent state, before they could receive communion. And so there was a real direct involvement in people's spirituality by the ruling elders of the church in a way that today we would consider this invasion of privacy and almost like an authoritarian overreach, right? The church that I served as a seminarian in New York City, Broadway Presbyterian Church, where I was interning, had all of these kind of relics from earlier in the 19th century. And one of the things they had were these coins, these tokens, communion tokens. And what you would do is you would go and meet with the session of elders to demonstrate that you were in right spiritual relationship with God and therefore deserving of receiving the communion. They'd give you the token, and then on Sunday morning, you would exchange that token for the communion. I mean, that sounds Pharisaic, right? That sounds intrusive, very disciplinarian and authoritarian. But I share that just to illustrate that things that we might find intrusive in Calvin's period were actually seen as the way the church disciplined. And by discipline, I don't mean punish. It literally, to be a disciple is to be a student, taught and directed the spiritual development of its members. And so when we read things that we're shocked by, we need to recognize that, well, that was 500 years ago. And the church had a lot more say in the day-to-day life of people then than it does today, right? So how much of that is Calvin and his personality, or how much of it is, no, that's what it meant to be a Christian in the 16th century. So that's my advice, that take a lot of what you hear about Calvin with a grain of salt, because so many versions of Calvin are out there. And yeah, sometimes he will come across as a disciplinarian, right? But he was also the head pastor of the city, and he had a burden, and one that he handled in ways that he shared the burden. There were every week he would meet with all the pastors throughout the city and all the churches in the city, and they would read the scriptures for the coming week together and prepare their sermons together. He preached every Wednesday, twice on Sunday. After the morning sermon, he would then lead the catechism class for the children every week, day in and day out. We have something like 2,000 to 3,000 surviving sermons of his. He was a workhorse in service to the congregation, to the Reformation. A lot of his letters were to pastors throughout the world, primarily Europe, but we have letters and correspondence with pastors in the New World as well. So, yeah, I say, no one's perfect. There are aspects of Calvin's theology I don't like, but if we remember that all of it is informed by pastoral care, then I think we're on safe ground and we can cut him some slack. Well, what I wanted to share about Calvin's theology of exile is brief. Again, on Book 3 of the Institutes is where Calvin summarizes the Christian life. And this part of the Institutes was the first part of his works that were translated into other languages. The first piece of Calvin translated into English and published throughout the English-speaking world. And at the heart of it is his own commentary on a brief passage from the Gospel of Mark. The gist of it is, we are not our own, we are God's. We belong to God. And that's the core of Calvin's spirituality and the core of this theology of exile, that in the end, we belong to God. And so when we make life choices, we ought to let, as we pray in the Lord's Prayer, let God's will guide us. And prayer is for him the chief exercise of piety, of faith. And Calvin has gotten a lot of grief because of his doctrine of providence. But what Calvin is trying to say is not that we are chosen and destined before we ever have a say in it, but rather that a proper understanding of providence is recognizing that God is over everything. And so he writes this: "For until people recognize that they owe everything to God, that they are nourished by his fatherly care, that he is the author of their every good, they will never yield him willing service." So in the end, what Calvin wants for all of us is to recognize the source of grace, so that then we can surrender our will in obedience to that grace. And so in some sense, we're kind of caught between two worlds. Kingdom of God, which is at once transcendent, and yet we get a foretaste of that kingdom here in the world. And so we're living in two places at once. We're both in the world, but also beyond this world. We have a goal, and that's the image of being an exile, of being a pilgrim. And so his theology of exile is grounded in this sense that the most adequate image for the Christian is that of a pilgrim or sojourner in the world. And so if you read some of the Pilgrim's Progress being the obvious one, but even Milton's famous poem, now I'm blanking on Paradise Lost, which, while it has a strong Arminian dimension, and Calvin was opposed to Arminianism, nonetheless, its roots were very much a reformed understanding of the Christian life. And Calvin wrote this: whatever kind of tribulation presses upon us, we must ever look to this end, to accustom ourselves to contempt for the present life, and to be aroused thereby to meditate upon the future life. Now, a lot has been said about this passage. Someone has accused Calvin of being a world denier and a world hater, hating the things of this life and this world. And that's not at all what he means. By contempt for the present life, what it means is that we shouldn't attach ourselves too much to this life, because some things are more important. And so he balances that passage in the very next chapter by saying a theology of exile also embraces this world as a gift from God. And so he says, away then with that inhuman philosophy which, while conceding only a necessary use of creatures, not only malignantly deprives us of the lawful fruit of God's beneficence, but cannot be practiced unless it robs a man of all his senses and degrades him. In other words, he's not a Stoic who's calling for this denial of the world. He's not a Gnostic who says everything material is sinful and evil. He embraces the things of this world as gifts from God, but reminds us that our life here is temporary. And so this is the famous line, both in the Institutes, but also in his comments on the Psalms. And his theology of exile draws a lot on David's Psalms and the experience of many of the Psalms, even though we say they were written by King David, were actually written during the period of exile. And Calvin was enough of a trained humanist and historian to have known this. And so his commentaries on the Psalms emphasize this dimension. So he says, for if heaven is our homeland, what else is the earth but our place of exile? And so in some sense, we're all refugees. We all are not citizens wherever we are. We will always be displaced, and we will always be dependent on someone else, on someone's mercy to survive, namely God's mercy.
Can I? So I want to draw the Christological connection here.
Perfect.
That the background of Calvin's claims about how we navigate our lives in the world is drawn from his understanding of the incarnation and the journey of the Son, and the ascension as well. So the life of Christ wholesale informs how he thinks Christians ought to comport themselves in the world, in the same way in which the Son, quote unquote, entered the far country.
Mm-hmm.
It's so there is a backing, a theoretical framing to this that's I just wanted to point out. The Christology behind it is what allows Calvin to make those kinds of claims without going into Stoicism.
A theology of union with Christ and participation in the life of Christ.
Yeah.
And so the communion plays a very important part. You know, Calvin was not Zwingli. For Calvin, the communion was more than a symbol, was more than a memorial act. And in his short treatise on the Lord's Supper, he called it medicine for the sick. It's because we are fallen and sinners. In Luther's language, simul justus et peccator, right? Even in grace, we remain sinners. And it's because of that we need the communion. And he called it medicine for the sick. The human condition is a fallen and imperfect condition. And what Christ has done is allowed us to be restored to full communion with God. But in this life, it remains always in process, always on the journey to, again, this language of exile and pilgrimage. And it's only when we reach the goal, when we are in heaven, that we are perfected and therefore no longer need the communion. So as long as we are in this life, union with Christ is what we're called to do and live, and therefore always focused on not just a moral obedience, but a submission of our will to Christ in obedience, in the hope that that sacrament will impute in us God's grace and allow us to better live in obedience to God.
In the same way in which Christ was obedient to the Father.
Exactly. Exactly.
Anyways.
Any other questions? Because I simply wanted to close with just looking at some of the more shocking aspects of immigration, displacement, refugee crisis, and how that leads to exploitation in our day and age, and therefore calls the church to recognize that this is a place where the church needs to speak clearly and be prophetic. So if there are no further questions about Calvin, his theology, or the historical background, I just wanted to bring up one example. Let me see. How do you... I want to... Here we go. Hide the... There we go. When most people think of immigration today in the United States, they think of people walking across the border, right? They think of our southern border, and it never occurs to them to think of how many are entering the country from Canada, which they are. But, just open question to anyone brave enough to answer it. Does anyone know where the largest entry point for undocumented immigrants is here in the U.S.? No one wants to venture a guess?
New York City.
You're actually correct. JFK Airport in New York City. Most people who become undocumented in this country and stay on as undocumented aliens enter this country through JFK Airport. They stay on either a holiday visa, vacation visa, or a student visa, and then just disappear. So all this talk about building a multi-billion-dollar wall to keep out undocumented folks doesn't even make a dent in the number of immigrants actually entering the country, because most of them don't enter through our southern border. Many are entering through our northern border, which is the longest undefended border on the planet. Canada has a large immigrant population from China, Pakistan, India, and more, these are the leading countries for people entering our country, not just Latin America, and they enter often through Canada. But yet, in all of the politics and all of the language of closing the borders, that's never addressed, right? Now I'm going to ask you another question, and I know I have it up on the screen here, but would you be surprised to learn that the largest case of human trafficking was not along our southern border, but was actually here in the state of Missouri? And it happened while I've been working and teaching here, and I found out about it because I was working with Catholic Charities on issues of immigration, and they were dealing with some of the families that had been smuggled into the country and trying to find them places to live and get them settled here. It was a company called Giant Labor Solutions, headquartered in Kansas City, Missouri. And what they did is they applied for 1,000 work visas legally, and then recruited 1,000 workers from the Dominican Republic, the Philippines, and Nigeria. Then, when those people entered the country legally with their green card, they took their passports, green cards away, and basically started treating them like slaves, keeping them 8 to a cheap motel room, charging them rent for those motel rooms. And then basically they were mostly doing housekeeping jobs in hotels and other businesses, landscaping work, sometimes work in the restaurant or in the meat packing business. But all of them living in fear, all of them dependent on this company who took away their papers. In the meantime, they took those 100 green cards and imported 1,000 more. And same conditions. And they kept doing this. And at one point, they were outsourcing cheap migrant labor to 14 different states out of Kansas City. And were keeping these people in like slave-like conditions. Eventually, one man, a man from Mexico, was brave enough and knew enough English to escape and found, I believe it was a church, explained the situation. The police got involved, and eventually the federal government got involved using the RICO Act, the same laws that were used to prosecute the mafia. And in 2009, were able to prosecute and imprison and charge some huge fines. But the irony is that the people the main criminals who owned this company fled the country. Rather, they had been, of course, creating offshore banks to hide their wealth, and when they knew that they were going to get convicted, fled the country. Why bring this up? Well, because again, it runs against the grain of the stereotype, right, of who's guilty on the issue of immigration. These were people who applied for legal green cards, legal visas to come work in this country, who for all intents and purposes thought they were obeying the law, had entered the country legally, had paperwork to that effect, but then were being manipulated by an American-owned company and turned into slaves, and it was the company breaking the law and exploiting the system. And yet, whenever we talk about illegal immigration in this country, all the focus is on who? On the illegal worker, rather than on the companies that employ these illegal workers. Why is that, right? And I think part of it is racism. Part of it is the politicians, the demagogues who have made it a focus on, these brown-skinned people are coming to take away your wealth. But again, how do we respond as a church? From a Calvinist social ethics perspective, the emphasis needs to be on preserving the image of God, the basic human dignity, and that then creates the need to establish a more just state. That yes, there is a separation of church and state, but that as Christians and as an institution, the church has a role to make sure that the state is behaving in ways that are moral and just, and in ways that protect the basic dignity of all people. In the context of a discussion on immigration, it means that we need to shift the discussion away from the undocumented worker and look at the business owner, right? If there wasn't a demand for undocumented workers, they wouldn't be here, right? And so if you look at the history of immigration reform, the biggest lobby group that has impeded a progressive and holistic immigration reform has been the small business owners in the U.S. Construction, landscaping, restaurant, hotels, agriculture. They depend on a migrant workforce that can be easily exploited in order to um, in order to increase their profits, basically. So that's kind of where we are. In case there are any more questions. But
I know we
yes.
are. I know we're a little over time, but yeah, I will be here. I want to be respectful of your time,
Well, we
but if people
started
still have
a bit
questions,
late
so
too. But next week then we're going to look specifically then at how this theology of exile and this Reformed theology has played itself out on issues of race. Because realistically, that was not an issue Calvin would have been talking about. He talked about ethnicity and nationalism, but race is not something he was dealing with, but it is something that the tradition that he established in Geneva has had to deal with here in the U.S., sadly in South Africa, and the struggle to end apartheid, in Latin America as well. Um, so that's going to be our focus for our last session together next week.
So John, you better come back next week because your question from earlier might get answered.
Can I ask a question? I know it's not part of this, but I'd be very interested in maybe as a United Methodist my whole life, I really don't understand predestination, and you just mentioned it. So
Yeah.
maybe not tonight, and if we don't have time, but maybe if you just think about a 3 or 4 minute explanation, if possible.
Well, I'll say this. Calvin called it that dreaded decree. He didn't like it.
Okay.
He dealt with it because he found evidence for it in the Bible. But he didn't invent it. Luther had predestination. Luther even had double predestination. So in some ways, Calvin has been kind of unfairly lumped with that piece. And it's such a small part of his overall theology.
Mhm.
But the ultimate idea is that everything rests on an act of God and grace. And therefore, there's nothing we do that adds or contributes to our salvation. And so this irresistible grace is always a sense of everything rests in God's hands. And if we have embraced that grace, then we will see the goodness of God.
Mhm.
17th
Okay.
century took Calvin's theology and created an orthodoxy out of it. The tulip, the Synod of Dort, the Dutch Reformed tradition, where not only is double predestination emphasized, but that grace is only for the elect, right? In that tradition, Christ didn't die for everyone's sins. Christ only died for the elect. That was not Calvin. That was Calvinism, but that was not Calvin.
Okay.
So that would be a good distinction to make, I think.
Okay. Really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think scripturally too, the most helpful piece of or verse of scripture, if I can remember where it is in understanding predestination, is before the foundation of the earth he chose.
Yeah. Is that Jeremiah? Or
yeah, but it's also in Paul.
Paul, yeah.
Ephesians. Yes.
Yeah.
Ephesians 1:4, for he chose us in him, that is in Christ, before the foundation of the world. So that as a scriptural interpretive key for the term predestination, I think can be real helpful.
And in reading through Calvin's Institutes, he always talks about the difference between how salvation occurs from God's perspective versus how we experience it as believers. And so for us, it begins with a conversion, right? And a sense of I was blind, now I see, something's changed. And that seems to imply that we contribute something through it. And Calvin is saying, no, God knew all along, right? But here's the key. Calvin also says, we don't know whom God will use to bring someone else to faith. And therefore, we need to assume that anyone we encounter is potentially could be saved by our own witness. And so we ought to behave in such a way that we're always a vessel of that grace. And I think that's a lovely image.
Yeah.
It's not that we earn it or that we're better than others, but rather if we're humble enough to recognize that since only God knows who's elect and who isn't, then it's our duty to then treat everyone as if they could be the potentially elect, and therefore do what's in our power to be a witness to the word. That's how Calvin would view it.
Okay.
Rather than this image of him sitting there and sorting people saved and damned, because he says that's not for the church to do. That would be usurping God. So, all right.
Great.
Well, it's been great.
Thank you.
I look forward to our last session next week, and but like I said, we're going to kind of look then. Okay, well, what does this theology of exile and this political theology then look like when we address issues of race?